You're listening to Convenience Matters, brought to you by NACS.
Welcome to Convenience Matters. My name is Jeff Leonard, and what we talk about today are things that matter to convenience stores. If they matter to convenience stores, they matter to the general public because we get about 160 million people a day to convenience stores.
And I'm John Eichberger with the Fuels Institute and NACS, and Jeff, you're right, we talk about things that motor the public. Convenience stores sell gasoline, sell food, anything you need to get from point A to point B to keep your car or body running, you can get at a convenience store 24/7, so that's what we're here to talk about.
And today, what we want to talk about is one of the big things that relates to convenience stores. It's the whole topic of fuels and where do we fit in when we have the spring transition, what's going on in California. And we have an expert here that's going to kind of guide us through some of the issues related to that.
So today we're joined by Tom Robinson, Robinson Oil, Rotten Robbie's out of San Jose, California. Tom has been chairman of NACS. He's been chairman of Sigma. He is known throughout the industry as one of the probably most critical thinkers when it comes to the fuels market. So glad to have you here with us, Tom. Welcome aboard.
Well, thanks. Welcome. I'm glad to be here.
So we're going to start off with a very easy softball. In the world of fuels, what are the things that are kind of piquing your interest right now? What are the things you're kind of paying attention to that makes you kind of go, that's kind of interesting?
So that's a softball.
That's a softball.
No, I think that every year as you roll into you sort of come out of the winter season, you get into all the turnarounds and you start getting into the spec changes. The question is how far is that market going to go up and when is it going to come down? And it tends to do that over and over and over again. And so, and then you overlay that with what's happening with crude prices, which is always, sort of the fundamental piece of fuels. So it's just always interesting to see how that plays out and the impact on supply and demand and prices.
So, we try not to talk about immediate events on this show because people listen to our show later on, but just this morning I read in the paper some reports that inventories in oil globally may be down, and that it put a little upward pressure on prices. So if prices start going up, what do you expect to see? If crude oil prices start going up, what's kind of the impact on the retail market when crude oil prices move?
Well, obviously when crude oil prices go up, then the wholesale prices are going to go up and retail prices are going to go up, and we've certainly seen that over the last few months. I think that the whole thing with inventories is fascinating to watch because it certainly changes from week to week. There's certainly a lot of optimism on the producer side that they're going to see inventories reduce. They've got to be very, very concerned about that because, it's only been in the last, the last few years since we've had the shale revolution that OPEC has lost control, more or less, of crude oil. And that's not something that they're terribly happy about. And so the real question is, as they attempt to control supply, how quickly do Americans ramp up supply, and does that, does it end up working for them? And I think it's going to be fascinating to see how that plays out. It continues to play out. So it's always interesting in the crude markets.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned OPEC because I remember watching the news in the 70s and that would be the top story, and whatever OPEC, if basically the same kind of line used with most things. It's like when OPEC sneezes, everybody gets a cold. It's an immediate effect, and it was profound in the early 70s, 73, 74, and then later 70s. And then they have about a third of the world's production. But today, it doesn't really have that same impact that it used to. When OPEC did something, the world markets moved. And what's interesting is we NACS just did a consumer survey, and we asked what are some of the causes that are related to when prices increase in the spring. Who might be some of those groups that you would say are responsible for that? OPEC was way down on that list in terms of how consumers perceive what's going on with prices. The one group that rated them much higher or cited them much higher were those over 50 who like me, remember those news stories from the 70s. But I think also the younger consumers don't realize how much control it was a cartel. It is a cartel. Yes, and it was much more of a dramatic impact. It was news story, price spike.
Well, there's evidence that at the end of 2016, OPEC decided to cut production, and for the first time in years, they actually stayed together and honored their commitments and reduced production. It did not affect markets. And a lot of that's because North America is now cranking out and can crank out so much oil that we can offset their pressure, which is I think is a good thing, because then you eliminate a single-handed influence on the market.
Now, Jeff, you used the word cartel, and the great thing about cartels is they fix prices, which is illegal.
Even when they're not broken.
and the challenge always is that it's a great system. It's a great system, and in the past, and in that past, I mean, you're talking 73, the 80s, the 90s, over 2000, a long, long time. Their only problem was themselves. And because what cartels do is they want everybody to cut back except for them.
Right.
I mean, individual countries. And so there's always the incentive that they're going to cheat. During that whole period, you could overlay different international events that would reduce supply, whether it was what was going on in Iraq, or revolutions in Libya, or, boycotts against Iran. All of those things worked with the cartel so that they could continue to be effective. And it was, really our free market, our crude revolution that messed it up for them. And so, as John said, in 2016, they tried to, in a sense, they've tried to get a grip back on it again. A key thing is that you're dealing with not only the cartel, but you're also dealing with some large producers that aren't part of the cartel, but may very well play with the cartel. Countries maybe like Mexico or Russia. Russia is certainly a huge player in the deal. And so it's just fascinating to see, what they're going to be able to do. Now, from the standpoint of the U.S., I mean, obviously we ramped up a huge amount. I mean, a few years ago I heard the statistic, which I thought was the coolest statistic, is that, and I don't remember exactly the dates from when to when, but the increase in production in the United States was greater than the output of any OPEC country except for Saudi Arabia.
Yep.
And so that number is such a huge number when you realize that was just the increase in our production. And so obviously we added obviously a very major player. Now, a lot of those guys got into trouble when crude oils went down into the 30s. That's not so good for them. So now the question is how quickly do they ramp back up? Because they obviously do better when it's in the 50s or even the high 50s or the 60s, and we're sitting today in the 50s somewhere.
But it's funny because the whole, what's the break-even price point? And we're talking about crude oil so much because at one point crude oil was 85% of the retail price of gasoline. When prices go up, crude oil's percentage goes up a lot higher as part of what we are selling. It's down in the 60s now, but it's still the largest factor that goes into retail prices. When you're in a situation where oil prices drop to 30, does it still make sense to produce? I'm looking at a chart that I found a couple weeks ago. Our cost of production has been cut in half from 2013 to 2016. The cost to produce a barrel of oil out of the shale reserves in the United States has dropped by 50%, which means that we can break even at $40 barrel oil. So as the Saudis or the OPEC nations try to reduce supply to boost prices, they've got an offset. So all we got to do is turn the spigot, turn these things back on. At $40 a barrel, it makes sense. And so we have a much different dynamic than we used to have, where it used to be $70, $80 as a break even for our oil production here in the United States. We've got the investment now in these wells because we're doing fracking. They're not as pressure sensitive, so you can turn them on and off. which is a great opportunity for us to continue as a country to play a very influential role in the long-term impact of crude oil prices.
Well, it used to be that you had to case them in, right? You had to just basically close them for good. And,
Right.
and so now the ability, it's think of it more like a Ziploc bag where it's resealable.
A Ziploc bag in the oil market. That's awesome. So, Tom, we've been talking about oil now for the most part of this conversation because it's such a critical function of the market. California is a unique experiment in terms of the regulatory environment. The most clean specifications for gasoline. From your perspective, you're operating there. You live and breathe it every day. What are you seeing? What are the big drivers that are happening in your market that might bleed over to other states and regions in the country as we go forward?
Well, it's the regulatory environment, which is certainly much more impactful in California, and it impacts lots of different ways. Whether you're talking about fuel specifications, which are challenging, and they are very challenging. So you always have the transition into the springtime. And Southern California moves at a different time than Northern California, so it just sort of compounds it, and you always overlay that with refineries coming out of major overhauls and turnarounds, and so that's always a big deal. But then I think it's even more so in the sense that refineries that continually need to upgrade their facilities, just finding the permitting challenges gets more and more onerous. And it can be more and more impacted by a local county or city that can make a big difference to whether, how fast that refinery gets to make their changes. So you're getting impacted, both from the specification side and then from the impact that the cities can have, and then you overlay it. The rest of the country deals with the renewable fuel standards and deals with RINs, and that impact where you got a market that is, depending upon what the market says the RIN value is, that can be a challenge to a challenge or a windfall to either a refiner or to a retailer. Well, in California, we've got cap and trade, cap and tax, I prefer to call it, and the low carbon fuel standard. And both instances with that is that because there's been a lot of discussion lately about the point of obligation for RINs on the federal level. In California, the shipper, the throughputter, the person that has the product before the rack is the point of is the obligated party. And so sorting through that, the capital requirements to be able to buy credits can be an impact to those. And so it has an impact on the market. It has an impact on the market. So you've got all of these things that sort of fall into this regulatory standpoint, whether it's permitting, whether it's fuel specs, whether it's RINs and cap and trade and the low carbon fuel standard. So you got all of those kinds of factors, and you overlay that with just trying to figure out if the market's tight or loose, and then I'll throw out the one last thing too, as a sort of stream of consciousness I have going on, is that we're an isolated market too. The refineries can't be, or the terminals can't be resupplied outside of the area. So if you end up having some sort of a hiccup, it tends to be always a wild and crazy period. And right now things are pretty smooth, but that can change, in 24 hours.
Well, we're in a just-in-time inventory market. So if there is a problem somewhere on the supply chain, you're out of luck because there's not a whole lot of supply just sitting around waiting for you to pick it up because the market's gotten so tight. Now, one of the things I think is interesting, when you're in this world and states and the government starting to talk about different regulations, it's very easy to be chicken little. The sky is falling. Low carbon fuel standard is going to put everybody out of business. Cap and tax is going to put everybody out of business. The renewable fuels standard is going to make it impossible to move product. This is one of the most resilient industries in the nation. It can accommodate. It can adjust. There's pain. There's struggles. You're now several years into the LCFS in California and the cap and tax program, a couple of things. Have you seen a real significant impact of these regulations on your business?
I guess the short answer is no. You're right. Our industry is very resilient, and it deals with all sorts of challenges. And I tell you, I think that the I won't call it the secret in this thing, but the reality is that the impact has been paid by the consumer. And the consumer continues to be the folks that get screwed in the process. Our job as retailers, because prices are going up and prices are going down, and prices go up, we raise our price. When prices go down, we lower our price. You're always trying to get another penny or two. You're always trying to improve your margin. But the reality is that our job is that we deal with the hand that we're dealt, and we pass it along. And so, the real question, I think the real question as we're going through this thing, I'm shifting maybe my answer a little bit, is whether, the short answer to your question is yes, we're resilient and we deal with this stuff. The real answer is, as we're dealing with all this stuff, is the consumer getting the bang for their buck? And that's harder to know.
Well, the bottom line is California's fuel prices are the highest in the country.
Generally.
And a lot of that is because of regulations. Jeff, all these regulations we're talking about are all designed to improve the environment. There's also a zero-emission vehicle requirement in California and 9 or 10 other states. Long-term, the combination of low-carbon fuel standard, the zero-emission vehicles, CAFE, the impact's going to be a reduction in fuel demand and increasing electric vehicles long-term that will ultimately affect the market. But in the meantime, I think Tom's absolutely right. The impact is the consumers are paying more at the pump to accommodate these programs. And I think every time we've asked customers, would you pay more to protect the environment? They go, absolutely, in a survey. But I've always said when they get to the pump, the only green they care about is on their wallet, not on the trees. So it's an interesting fact that the immediate impact may be transparent from a market standpoint, but the customer is definitely feeling even if they don't know why.
Yeah, and you're seeing a stress system. It's a system that's working, but Tom mentioned just the idea of the refineries. We have half the refineries we had 35 years ago. So when a refinery goes out in California, it's more of an impact. California has about 12,000 convenience stores. That's number 2 of all the states behind Texas. But if you look at population, stores per capita, California probably should have about 18,000. But they don't because of various regulations and some difficulties in having stores. So it does place more stress when there's refineries out, when there's the inability to open new stores, just added stress to the system. It will evolve, it will survive, but Tom and you were absolutely right that the consumer is ultimately the one that is the end point of an unpleasant system.
So I guess the last topic I'll raise is what, from your perspective, Tom, just in terms of optimism about the industry, how are you feeling about the next 5 to 10 years for the fuel retailing industry?
Oh, I think it's a great business to be in. It's a great business. It's number one. You're seeing. If you wanted to get out of the business, people are paying a lot of money, and so there's an exit strategy if that's what you'd like to do. If you want to be in the business, we're continuing to see, as a retail segment, we continue to be, very, very healthy. And I think, and we're still a very, very fragmented industry. I mean, so there's just so many players. There's certainly not, the great thing is we're not in an industry where there's a dominant national player. There's not even dominant, really regional players much. So there's opportunities for somebody that's a single store operator that wants to be a 10-store operator, or a 10-store operator that wants to be a 50-store operator, or a 50-store operator that wants to be a 200-store operator. There's opportunities for all of them. Or, it's a time that you can sell and, you can get out of the business. So it's, the options are just, are many. And it's, generally it's been very, very healthy. So,
I like to use the word the last several years called optionality. And people ask me, John, what do I need to do to prepare for the future fuel demand? It's like, increase your options. Find out what you need to do to be able to move into a new opportunity when it arises at the lowest cost possible. And I like this idea is you have the option to grow, contract, sell, enter, you name it. It is a very fluid industry with a lot of opportunities in it. So that's a great thing.
And the headline, Tom Robinson from Rotten Robbie says, the future is not rotten. That is good.
You've been listening to Convenience Matters, brought to you by NACS. For more information, go to nacsonline.com.